I've been given a big chunk to chew on, so I'm going to be as fast as I can possibly be, and I hope this doesn't make things too garbled. This morning we had an introduction to, I guess, values, which focused on some emergent transcendentalism. I'm afraid I'm not an expert on the transcendental approach to values, so I'm not going to say too much about that. But it did remind me that I should mention the discourse about values has permeated religion for aeons in almost all traditions. And I actually have a chapter in a book that I wrote which I sought to ambitiously distill as many of the values as I could and compare and contrast them with the values that are extant in the preamble to the UN Charter. I'm not sure if I was successful, but that's what I did do. In a nutshell, yes, we have the religious aspect of it, but we also have a secular aspect of it. The famous Roman jurist Ulpian is reputed to be essentially the original father of human rights law. And he was a Stoic philosophy, so a great deal of those values were snuck into the law, and people can trace modern human rights back to Ulpian himself. Now, the great influence of values on law comes from Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, and this was really the rationalization development of something called natural law. And but natural law at that time didn't provide us with a code, a kaleidoscope of specific values and so on. There were a few there, but not much. What Aquinas suggested was that human reason is a product of God and is a product of natural law. So when we go through reason, we are using natural law to solve problems in the real world. That grew to be somewhat important in the late 1700s when the biggest and most important jurist from England, Blackstone, sought to basically collapse the common law and the civil law into the notion that all of these were directly ordained by God and therefore they were natural law. That created a big conflict between Blackstone and Bentham, and Bentham called natural law nonsense on stilts. When we come into the century, the most important development from the standpoint of global governance occurs. Austin delivered a series of lectures published after his death called The Province of Jurisprudence Determined. And this book, quite unpopular with the intellectuals of the time, proved to be profoundly popular with the sovereigns of the time, in part because it basically made the case for sovereign absolutism. And so if a sovereign wrote the book, so the theory of law requires me, if you like, to be a sovereign absolutist, you see. And so that raised the question of whether, under Austin's system, there can be an international law. And Austin said, no, there's no such thing as international law. It's just positive morality, you see. Indeed, he also went so far as to say there's no such thing as constitutional law. So you can see these are really dramatic, and yet this is, today I still think it is the conventional wisdom of many, many sovereigns that draw their sustenance from law to justify the sense of non-obligation for international obligations. Now, when we move from Austin into the 20th century, Malinowski, the anthropologist, was a guy that provided us with the first inkling of how we might make values central to social process. And he didn't use the word values, he used needs. And he observed needs in the Trobriand islanders and institutions by which the needs were satisfied. And so needs as a synonym for values creeps in. Radcliffe Brown in England took that and simply called it values, and so we got a value institutional way of describing society. And Laswell took that much further after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by distilling 9 values and institutions corresponding to those 9 values, which represents cross-culturally a framework, a fundamental framework of human social process. So you would define human social process in these terms. Human beings seek values through institutions based on resources. Okay, That's the simple model of it. And it's a model that can be extrapolated from a local authority or a small group to the global community. And the challenge that he saw then was to develop a way in which we could develop this value institutional model of social process, complex as it was. If we could develop this with a system of mapping, and we could borrow from mapping models from the hard sciences to develop a map of social process and to map the global social process, and more importantly, if you have a map of that social process, you can also map the problems, the value problems of that global social process. And so contextual mapping became the foundation of the idea of a global society organized around values and institutions and other practices. Now, the fundamental question still was not answered, namely, how do you validate? You can't validate them. Said you can't get an is from an ought to an ought from an is. And so the solution for Laswell and his colleagues was to follow the example of Myrdal, who wrote a famous book called The American Dilemma. And what Myrdal did was he found that for the purposes of research, he could guide his research normatively by abstracting from the American experience of the Bill of Rights the idea of equality, and he could test the practice of equality against the professed ideals of the system. Myrdal didn't try to justify this other than to say, well, it's there in their official documents and so on. Laswell modified that, and his colleagues, by suggesting that we can avoid the problem of finding an application for the most foundational principles behind the values, namely human dignity, by simply postulating it. And with a postulate, it's a provisional principle to guide inquiry into the condition of man in society at the global level. So postulation became the way in which he organized a great deal of his studies in world public order. I should say that the research has gone much further than that, including contributions from Amartya Sen and Ronald Dawkin. And Dawkin, I think, has been the most successful so far last year's book. Technically provided a way of providing a justification for the human dignity principle. I won't go into the detail of it, but I can if you like later. But the fundamental point that Dawkin was addressing was one typical of moral philosophy, namely, if a moral or value proposition is to have currency, it has to be justified by reasons external to the state. Central point, not by your own subjective reasons, but by reasons external to the statement maker. And so that's sort of where we are more or less on the value debate and how you justify the human dignity principle. Now, one of the aspects of that's confusing is that also use it in a normative sense. To use it descriptively is to simply inquire into what the score is about the production of distribution of values in any given society or any aspect of the universe of society. That is descriptive inquiry. But the next step is, how ought the values to be produced and distributed? And that's a normative inquiry. So that's the one that requires, if you like, the idea of a justification for the human dignity principle. Now, this now gets me into the description of society, or social process. Using the value institutional analysis we've just mentioned, basically what Laswell was able to do was to develop a map, not only of any particular society, but of the global social process as a whole, a very ambitious map. Highly complicated, lawyers have difficulty with it, although I don't find it difficult at all. And he provided us with the guidelines of the map, asking a series of questions: who the participators are, what their perspectives, identity, demand, and expectation are, what base values do they have at their disposal, in what situations do they operate, what strategies do they deploy, and what are the outcomes and what are the effects. So that's the map, and it can be really spelled out with modern computer techniques in any level of detail. Now, to jump from your description of social process and mapping it, the central point that I, at least in my research, have tried to stress is is the ability to, first of all, delineate practically what the problems are that are outcomes of the social process. And that gives you particularity. So even if you have this large-scale framework, you have the particularity to focus inquiry. And the second part of that is, if you can delineate all the problems in terms of their different phases, you can also predict the problems. And that's an extremely important thing for any policymaker. So those are two very significant things that come out of this way of doing things. Now, one of the most important outcomes of social process are contestations for power. There are going to be conflicts about power. There are going to be different interest groups vying for power. We don't understand a lot about it. The literature that we inherited, Marxism says it's class. Somebody else says, oh, it's elites. Somebody else says it's groups or consociationalism or pluralism or whatever. But these were never precise enough for us to get a handle on the problem of power, its potentials for good as well as its dangers that it might pose for humanity. And so Laswell's work then focused on the interrelationship of personality and power. And one of his great inventions was the principle of a political personality. That is to say, we do reproduce personalities that are predisposed to power, that are oriented to power, that are oriented to the management and control and regulation of power, sometimes in their own interest, sometimes in the interest of the community. And the formula he used was the political personality is one who displaces his private motives on public objects and rationalizes in the public interest. From that element of work, we got ideas like the totalitarian personality, the authoritarian personality, the democratic personality, and so on, as factors that must be accounted for in any realistic description of the framework of power in society. Now, the problem of the power process, of course, is it came up in the context of the Cold War, and the people who talked about power, raw power, were the Russians. And power for them was merely class dominance by another name. And so the whole debate about power in Western sociology and law was people wanted to shy away from this raw description of power because the Russians dominated the field to a large extent. And so Laswell faced some difficulty getting Western lawyers, in particular and social scientists, to grab more honestly with the problem of power. Now, the importance of grappling more honestly with it is because we now realize that that power is quite complicated. If you have too much power in the state, what are the countervailing forces from civil society and learned societies and other societies that can balance or counterweight the problem of the possible abuse of power? And so the idea of contextualizing power so that we identify a larger range of potential participators is also something of an empowering process, because it encourages those others to participate and actually we all carry the responsibility for change. And then we try this, turn this over into the notion of society reproducing the democratically oriented personality. Well, the democratically oriented personality isn't there for a free ride. He's there because he has to participate in the shaping and the sharing of power, so they all participate and that the public interest or the common interest of the community is realized. So those are, now when you come to law, this is a really difficult problem for non-lawyers, even for lawyers, and that is the contestations about power have outcomes. And one of the most important historically and contemporaneous outcomes of power is the effort to institutionalize and regularize. You can't have continuous fighting. You have to find some way so that power is allocated to the judges, allocated to the legislators, to the administrators, to the private sector, and so forth. The allocation of power is the most fundamental principle of constitutionalism. Now, when we take that and we apply it globally, well, it's a much more complicated thing. The allocation of power globally, is it with the UN? Is it with civil society? Is it exclusively with the states? Now, what we've seen, I think, in this period of history after the Second World War is that is the resilience of the territorially organized sovereign. And the territorially organized sovereign has not wanted to subordinate its interest to the authority or competence of a supra-national body like the UN or anything else for that matter. So that what we have then is, as some UN people have said, you know, the UN is run by a directorate of states. The most powerful states have their way, and if they don't want something, they block it. So I think it's true to say that we do have a problem, as Ivo mentioned, with sovereignty. I've drawn his attention to the fact that sovereigns are lethal. I mean, if you look at the track record, sovereign murder is catastrophic. That doesn't mean we have an easy replacement for it, but it does mean that we have to exercise caution in blindly allocating authority to sovereigns at whatever level, and we therefore are confronted with the problem of serious reform of the UN General Assembly, serious reform of the Security Council, ways to empower civil society as a component of the outside looking in. And so in a sense then, that challenge of understanding, first of all, the global constitutional process, understanding precisely how in operation power is allocated and perhaps inappropriately distributed. And there's so little understanding of that by non-lawyers, let alone lawyers, that Chirac said, oh, we have a global constitution. What he means is we have a piece of paper that looks like a decoration, you know, and that, but there's a serious component of attempting to much more carefully delineate the framework of power within the international system, and of course made more complicated by the emergence of other centers of power like the OAS, the European Union, and regions as well. And then our power problem is still more complicated because of the plutocratic force of business on national societies, reshaping policies in ways that directly affect them, and yet the same multinationals refuse to accept responsibility for the human rights violations that they will commit in their activities elsewhere, you see. So we still have a great contestation for power with labor, with capital, with civil society, with intellectuals, and so on. We haven't resolved those questions, but we would be better off if we understood the contestations within the framework of this global constitutional process that we now actually do have. Thank you.